Hi, everyone. My name is Arden Tucker, and I'm the host for today. Thank you very much for joining us for our first masterclass webinar on the death of the other cookie, implications of iOS 14 on digital advertising. Okay, so without further ado, let's get started. We wanted to kick things off with a fun poll to keep it light, as we know there's lots going on in the world today. All these dogs are dogs of MightyHive Canada employees, and we'd like you to vote for the cutest one. Our team is really invested in their dogs, and the stakes are high because bragging rights are up for grabs. Okay, it looks like we're getting a lot of engagement here.
I personally think Homer is the best, so please vote for Homer.
Okay, we're going to give it a few more seconds, and then we'll come back to the results of the poll later on in the webinar. Okay, a few housekeeping notes. Please submit your questions through the Q&A function. If we don't have a chance to answer all your questions live, we'll follow up with a written response. Okay, as I already mentioned, my name is Arden Tucker, and I'm your host for today. I joined MightyHive in July 2020. Prior to that, I was at an independent trading desk. And a fun fact about me, I used to be part of an axe throwing club back when we could go out into the world and do those things.
Hi, my name is Iryna. I have been in MightyHive since mid-2018. So this year will be my 3-year anniversary at MightyHive. And previously to MightyHive, I was working on the agency side and at the trading desk. In terms of fun fact about myself, I was the second employee at the Toronto office after our managing director, Tessa. And I moved to Vancouver, where I'm based right now, to start MightyHive West Coast team.
Everyone, I'm Nick, also based out of Vancouver, but originally from Montreal. So I've been in Vancouver for about 2 years and then joined MightyHive a little under a year ago, so June of last year. Before coming to MightyHive, I was working at a couple different agencies, again, some in Montreal, some out in Vancouver. And fun fact about me, I'm strangely good at limbo. That I only realized that a couple of years ago, before COVID, at a friend's wedding, when there was a bit of a spontaneous limbo contest, which I cleaned up at. So maybe not the most useful skill, but good to have in the back pocket if you're at a wedding, I guess.
Okay, I thought we would go back and revisit the results of our poll. Let's see, who's the cutest MightyHive dog?
Yes.
Oh, no, we need.
Well, it looks like it's a tie.
Yeah, we need a tiebreaker.
For Homer and Maya. Okay, so our office Slack will be lighting up. It must have been the raincoat that must have really helped.
He has the best raincoat. He's the dog of the neighborhood. So thanks, everyone.
Yes, thanks for participating. So in terms of today's agenda, we'll be covering an overview of iOS 14 changes, and then we'll go into specific campaign preparations from Google and Facebook, followed by a Q&A, and then a list of resources will be shared when we follow up with the slides. Okay, so today, if there's one thing that we want you to remember from this presentation, it's that iOS 14.5 changes are currently in beta, and they're rolling out to a wide release sometime next week. Apple announced that yesterday at their event. They're going to have big impacts on your digital advertising campaigns. The good news is there's steps you can take today to prepare. So you're probably wondering, what are these changes and what do I need to know about them as a digital marketer? Today, we'll be talking about iOS mobile operating system share in Canada, why this is happening now, and what you can do immediately and in the future to be ready. Okay, so really, you should take notice. Apple has a major share of mobile operating systems in Canada at over 52%. This is significant. According to StatCounter Global Stats, the latest version of iOS 14.4 has a 76% penetration in Canada, and we expect this momentum to continue with new releases. So people are updating their iOS when new versions come out. iOS 14.5 is already in beta, and it's going to launch imminently. And app tracking transparency will roll out with this launch. So what exactly are the changes? Apple will officially roll out app tracking transparency, or ATT, in iOS 14.5. Any users who have upgraded will now be served a pop-up, like the example on this slide, when downloading or opening apps that will require them to opt into sharing their data with advertisers in order to track them across websites and apps. So this data is known as IDFA, which is Identifier for Advertisers. And basically IDFA is a unique tracking ID, which allows advertisers to track users across mobile environments without the use of their personal information. So it provides advertisers with greater control over things like frequency and targeting, as well as ad personalization. It basically acts like a cookie within the app environment, but it's more reliable since it can't be reset. So something to note, as more people opt out of tracking on iOS 14 devices, personalization and performance reporting will be limited for advertisers and platforms such as Google and Facebook. So why is this happening now? Why has this come to fruition now? Essentially, there's an increase in consumer privacy concerns. This conversation has been brewing well before this timeline. Many users feel they've lost control over their data. And this is Apple's solution to that problem. So Apple is really being a leader and a trailblazer in this space. So this timeline is really a history of the various government and tech player changes that have taken place to address these concerns. And the biggest takeaway from this is that the frequency and the number of updates are increasing. Okay, moving on. Next slide, please. So what's Apple's take on this? As I've touched on, Apple CEO Tim Cook has come out strongly to voice that they believe users' privacy should be prioritized and how their data is being used by corporations should be transparent. What did the duopoly initially say? Google's been focused on charting a new course towards a privacy-safe web and initially didn't address the announcement. Facebook came out with the polarizing stance that Apple is hurting small businesses with this rollout, but more recently, Mark Zuckerberg has said that it may actually benefit Facebook if more businesses conduct commerce on their platforms. And later in this presentation, Nik and Iryna will be discussing their recommendations as they relate to campaign activities. So in terms of timing, I'm going to reiterate, the mass rollout of iOS 14 is scheduled to happen next week, which will include ATT. And developers were given notice in early December. So the industry has known that this has been happening for a while. So now is the time to prepare. So as a digital marketer, you're probably wondering, what is the significance? As I've alluded to, people are going to opt out of tracking as they don't want to share their data freely. What does this mean? It means advertising on iOS to iOS users will be less measurable based on the old models. This has big implication across media buying, attribution, frequency, targeting, reporting. And Nik and Iryna will talk about the specifics as it relates to the walled gardens later on in our presentation. So according to an IDFA survey, 62% of consumers will not allow app tracking in iOS 14. So this means the way you were measuring your campaigns is going to have to change. The biggest factor that determines if a user will provide consent is how well they know the brand. So if they trust your brand, they'll be more likely to opt into tracking. As well, users would be more willing to opt in if they know why you want their data and what you're going to use it for. So if you're explaining to those users that you want your data so you can provide a free app experience, that may be a compelling reason for them to share their data with you. So long-term, what does this mean? Well, Apple hasn't released a long-term plan, but it appears that IDFA may follow the path of the third-party cookie and be reduced in effectiveness and possibly removed altogether. So there are other ways apps can map users to download, such as probabilistic matching or email addresses, but these will be less common than the built-in IDFA. So what does this mean? It means brands and publishers will need to build trust and explain the benefits of opting in. Strategies are going to need to shift to fill those gaps. So we're going to rely more on first-party data, things like contextual targeting, and look to media mix modeling to fill the dots, or sorry, connect the dots. Okay, now I'm going to hand it over to Nick to talk about the specific Google impact.
Thanks, Arden. So I'll walk through how some of those changes that Arden was just talking about is going to have a direct impact on Google advertising. So there's still lots of question marks, not only when it comes to iOS 14, but really in the future of privacy, right? No one has all those answers, but one thing I think a lot of us can agree on is that there are changes coming, right? We might not know what those changes are, but we do know there are certain changes that are coming, and we're starting to get a better idea of how we should, one, be managing our campaigns, which can involve how you're structuring your campaigns, the audiences that are available, the targeting that you're leveraging, how you're optimizing, but then also the measurement aspect is really important for marketers as well too, right? We want to make sure that we're understanding how we need to be changing how we're interpreting data. Are we going to see a drop off in conversions, spikes in CPA? So I'm going to go through a couple of slides and we'll talk about, what some of our recommendations in terms of how we can start thinking about changes to the management of our campaign, and also changes in how when we measure our campaign. And we'll definitely be talking around what model conversions are and what some of the benefits and what some of the cons are as well too. But really, before we go into anything too in depth around iOS 14 or privacy changes, I think that it's important just to remind everyone that every advertiser is different, right? And I don't just mean in terms of the products or the services that provide, but really in terms of what their goals and objectives are on running paid media, on digital advertising through Google. Every advertisers are specific and they have their own goals. We might have, all want to drive brand awareness or sales. At the end of the day, we have specific goals, and those are all unique to our own advertisers. And the reason why that's important is because whether it's an iOS 14 change or upcoming privacy changes, is not all the changes are going to have a direct impact on your advertiser and your campaign. That's why it's important to really start to think about what your goals are, so that when you see these changes come out and we have iOS 14 changes and other upcoming privacy changes, we're able to say like, okay, this change is going to have a really big impact on me, or you know what, this one coming up in a couple months, it's going to have a little bit less of an impact, right? So once you understand what your client's goal or what your campaigns and advertisers' goals are, and that could be multiple goals, you might be trying to drive awareness, sales, that's fine. But once you start to have an understanding of what your specific goals are, it's a lot easier to put together that picture of really how you're going to be impacted by upcoming privacy changes. So one area that Google is at least kind of suggesting that we start to prepare ourselves in is, one, a potential drop off in overall reach and engagement and fluctuation in KPIs. And this is really specific and going back to understand your campaigns, but specific to if you're running inventory on app inventory or if you're running app install campaigns, right? Because if you're running the majority of your inventory or ad spend on desktop devices, the impact from iOS 14 is going to be very different if you're running most of your inventory on app or app install campaigns, right? So these specific topics of what to prepare for is this is specific if you're running in-app inventory, right? Where the potential drop off in reach is coming from is there is a chance that certain audiences won't be able to scale as well that they have been done so in the past, right? We may see a total drop off in audience match rate. So audiences that we may have been able to spend thousands of dollars a day for in the past we might not be able to scale that well for in the future, right? So that's where Google is just cautioning we may see a potential drop off in reach in our app install campaigns or any inventory that's run in app, because we don't really know yet what that kind of total drop off in certain audiences is going to be. But it is very relatively safe to assume that there could be a drop off there. So one thing to keep in mind is just keep an eye on your overall spend, engagement, impressions on any inventory that's running in app or app install campaigns. What's a little bit harder for us to predict, and not just Google, but for anyone, is really understanding how certain KPIs are going to fluctuate, right? We can safely assume that, yes, there could be a drop off in total spend for, app installs or in-app inventory because, certain audiences won't be able to scale better as well. Where it's a little bit hard to predict is what type of fluctuations we're going to see in KPIs, right? We know that, we could see a drop off in spend, but it's hard to predict how CPMs are going to be affected, CPAs, click-through rate, CPCs, right? So what Google is just cautioning now is, in addition to looking at your, main KPIs of, CPA it could be, or spend, also keep a close eye on other metrics that you might not necessarily be looking at on a daily or weekly basis. Things like click-through rates, CPMs, CPCs. Those are type of metrics you want to have a closer eye on than you maybe would in the past, because maybe, for example, we'll see, less people bidding on, in-app inventory right now. So there could be, drop in competitiveness, and we could be much more cost efficient with our CPMs. If that's the case, great. We could also see the opposite, where people know that there's a little bit less inventory that we can scale on. So people are being much more aggressive, and you're seeing a spike in CPM. So that's where it's really difficult to predict what we'll see. So it's important just to keep a close eye on any campaigns that are running on in-app inventory or app install campaigns. Don't just look at the total spend and CPA, but all the top level metrics. So I'll keep going then around the management of our campaigns in terms of what are some of the things that we can think about in terms of how we can think about the structure of our upcoming campaigns and how we might want to treat overall optimizations, and then we can look at that. So first off, what's not necessarily new from Google is they're suggesting more of an approach to campaign consolidation. And why I'm saying it's not really new, because we've heard Google say in the past, hey, run these campaigns in another 2 weeks, add more budget, because the goal is to have more data, right? We want to have more data, have a stronger results to analyze. So it's not new to hear them say campaign consolidation, but why it's important, a trend that I think we could see continue, is because if there's limited amount of data, potentially with, a drop off in app, what we can measure, we want to start thinking about being a little bit more consolidated rather than the opposite of segmenting and being a little bit too thin, but focus more on campaign consolidation, so that when we're building out our app install campaigns or campaigns that we know we're going to leverage in-app inventory, think of more grouping those together, grouping your audiences together, your line items together, whatever it is, but have more of an approach towards consolidation rather than spreading yourself a little bit too thin. And one suggestion, and it's a little bit specific, but we have an idea of where we're trending and which way we're going, is that Google's suggesting, for example, that for your app install campaigns, make sure you're limiting yourselves to a maximum of 8 campaigns per app that you're trying to promote. And again, that's pretty specific, right? But we see where the thinking is and where we're heading. So that's kind of one approach that we can start kind of changing our mindset to, is how we're structuring our campaigns in the future, to know that there could be a limitation in data. So let's be a little bit more concise and consolidated. The second topic I'll add to, in terms of how we can think about managing our campaigns, is around audiences and targeting, because there's a lot of questions around, what audiences are going to be available, how are we going to address the total drop off and reach, and those are totally fair concerns. So one feature I'm going to dive into a little bit more is an audience expansion tool. And this isn't new to DV360, but it's just, there's a bit of an expansion in terms of how we can apply it right now to our campaigns. So in the past, when we were building lookalike audiences, we would build it use the modeling off of any type of first party data, if we wanted like a CRM audience or website visitors, whatever it is. And we would tell the platform, right, how we want it to model it. Do we want it to be very narrow so that audience is similar to our first party data, but we'll limit our reach? Or do we want to go on the flip side and say, hey, you know what, we're okay with kind of sacrificing some of that similarity. We want to really boost out that reach, right? So there's pros and cons to both. But up until fairly recently, that option to expand your audience was only available on lookalike audiences. But what we've seen recently is Google's included that same feature now on Google own audiences, so Google Affinity and Google in-market audiences, where in the past, if you wanted to target, someone that was in market for jeans and there was just 3 million unique people in Canada, you were kind of stuck with that 3 million audience, right? That you couldn't really do much about expanding that. But now with this audience expansion tools, you have that ability to really say to the platform, hey, you know what, I'm okay with broadening that out a little bit. If Google's algorithm can say, hey, you know what, people are also in market for shoes or, you know, whatever, sweatpants, if they're also shopping for jeans, well, I'm okay to broaden out my reach. And I know this isn't really a revolutionary tool for DV360, totally. But why it's important is, again, we're starting to see Google, even if it's in a small way, address some of these concerns of, you know, lack of audience reach. How do we expand our scale? And how do we kind of really leverage that first party data that we have a little bit more? So even if this is really just a small feature to start, this is only available right on Google-owned audiences, and you can't do this yet in custom audiences, it's really important to start to get familiar with what type of audiences we have that can use this feature so we can get familiar on how to expand our audiences. Great, so I'll move forward and move out of the management aspect of our campaigns and more into the measurement, because there's definitely a lot of questions around, you know, how our CPA is going to change, how is conversion volume going to drop off if there's even more conversions we can't track anymore, right? So I'm going to talk about model conversions, and not because they're brand new to Google at all, but I think that it's important to start familiarizing ourselves with those. With more and more traffic being served, or ads being served in inventory on in-app, I think it's pretty safe to assume that we're going to see more of an increase in dependence on model conversions. And what model conversions are, it's just Google's way to use aggregated anonymized data to attribute conversions that the advertiser wouldn't necessarily be able to attribute themselves in the platform, right? Whether it's a cross-device conversion, an in-app conversion. Google's using these model conversions just to say, hey, you know what, we recognize this consumer behavior, we understand what's going on, but we also understand that we're not able to track what this and a conversion, right? So it's Google's way of just saying, hey, you know what, we know we can't track it, but we're going to attribute this as a model conversion so we have that full picture of what's going on. Now, what I want to go into is not just, you know, the main reason that I think a lot of people think of why we want model conversions. Right? We want to have that, you know, give full credit to our campaigns. If we say, hey, you know what, the platform only tracked 100 conversions on the regular conversions, but we drove another through in-app through model conversions, we want to give fair credit to what our CPA is, right? But the main goal, or maybe not the main goal, but a really secondary goal to having these model conversions is from the optimization standpoint as well too, right? Because if you're making decisions of where to cut budgets and where to kind of, you know, double down on certain audiences, if you don't have these audiences in place, you have a pretty major blind spot of certain audiences could be converting, right? Maybe you have a significant percent of your audience that is really only engaging through a certain number of apps, and they're not really engaging on, you know, mobile or web browsers. If you're not tracking that, it's really leaving that blind spot to say, hey, you know what, you're kind of missing out on all these conversions. So that's why it's important to not only think of the model conversions and say, hey, you know what, Google has the lowest CPA. That's, yeah, sure, they're doing their job to making sure that we have that full picture to have an accurate CPA. But it's also from the media buyer standpoint who's in the platform making those analytical decisions and cutting budgets or cutting tactics or doubling down on budgets. You want to make sure you have that full picture to where, you know, the performance is. And then finally, if, you know, you're not willing to trust model conversions yet, or you want to test, you know, the difference of having them enabled or not, you have that option to opt in, opt out within conversion modeling in Campaign Manager. Great. And just before I pass it over to Iryna to dive into Facebook, just wanted to recap on 3 points here if you're going to kind of take anything away from the Google impact. And that's one, just have a review for your current campaign to understand where and how you may be impacted, right? Understand what your goals are, understand how much inventory you have running on apps right now or app install campaigns. So we just get a firm understanding of what your campaigns are running on right now. 2, enable targeting expansion. That's going back to the audience expansion tool I was mentioning before. Start taking a look at the audiences you have that may or may not be eligible to use this. Test out, you know, if you use this feature, how much is it going to improve your scale? Do you see any changes in CPA? So start getting familiar with it, because I think that this could be a trend that we could see roll out potentially on other audiences as well. And then finally, ensure that if you are interested in leveraging kind of the benefits of model conversions, make sure that you are opted in Campaign Manager. Thanks. So I'll pass it over to Iryna now.
Great. Thank you, Nick. I'll take it over from here, and we'll walk everyone through the Facebook impact portion of our webinar. Okay, so before we jump into the specifics, we wanted to start with this question. Since most of our clients are actually using GMP products, we're just wondering how many of you are actively running Facebook or Instagram ad campaigns? So I'll give you a few seconds to reply to this question. Okay.
Lots of engagement on the poll.
Nice. Okay, I think we got most of the people answered. Great. I think we can move on to the next slide, and the last few will have a chance to vote. Okay, so let's talk about Facebook impact. What is changing for Facebook and why is it important? In terms of what is changing, as Arden already mentioned at the beginning of our webinar, basically, as more people will opt out of their tracking, ad personalization and campaign reporting will be limited. That's a fact. And why is it important? Because basically all of the businesses that advertise app install campaigns or would be running on mobile devices, including iOS 14, will be impacted because they will be either using mobile app install campaigns or then using web conversions for those campaigns that they're running. Okay, maybe we can go back and see the results. Okay, so it looks like 84% of everyone who replied running campaigns, which is great. So maybe we can just jump into the next slide. Okay, awesome. So what is the Facebook response to all of this? I guess Arden already shared some of the responses that Facebook had, but they did put together a tool. And if you've seen any of the recent webinars that Facebook hosted, they did quite a lot of them in the last couple of months. They basically talk about something called aggregated event management. And this is a screenshot of the tool, how it would look like. So this is basically a response from Facebook to Apple changes, and they will use this tool to process all of the website conversions from iOS 14 devices. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, and so I wanted to kind of take a moment and talk about how we can prepare to changes. Before anyone could start using the aggregated event management tool that I showed on the previous slide, you will need to verify your domain. You can go into your business manager and find a section where you can do that. And there's also ways that pop up if you go to event management tool that will have a direct link to that. So basically the very first step would be to verify your domain. After that, if you haven't already done so, you'll be able to go into the event management tool and then select the top 8 events for your web conversions. And basically, you will do that in that tool that I had a screenshot of on the previous slide. And moving forward, you will use any of the 8 events for the optimizations for your campaigns. And if you would want to use another event, you have to go in and change the top 8 to include that event. For campaigns that are already running and using other events, additional events, those would be paused. And basically, if you ever want to use additional events, you'll have to change the list, or you can still use them for partial reporting and custom audiences. And if you're running, sorry, just the previous slide, just the last point, if you're running app install campaigns, you will need to update to Facebook SDKs. So there's version 8 or you need above that. Or if you're running campaigns using Facebook logins, basically you use Facebook logins to your app, then you need a version 9. And you can update it in Event Manager.
Iryna, I want to ask you a question. When
Sure.
should advertisers be making these changes?
Yeah, so for Facebook, I think it became available, this tool became available sometime in, I think, late January or February. So you should already have aggregated event management tool in your Facebook Manager. If you don't, I would probably recommend contacting your Facebook support, because you should already have access to that. And then I think we already had mentioned this, and Arden mentioned it a couple of times, that iOS 14.5 changes will roll out next week. So as soon as you can make the changes, and as soon as you can go in and update your domain, like verify your domain and update those events, the better. And in case if you wouldn't do it before next week, Facebook will actually automatically select the 8 events that they think your business, they're most important for your business, basically. So that's going to be selected for you. And then, yeah, you can go in and update it.
Thank you, Iryna. That's great.
Cool. Okay. So there are quite a few limitations that we need to be aware of because of the iOS 14 updates. And we can start with ad creation limitations. So I think Nik already mentioned some of those for Google, and they will be very similar for Facebook. So for example, in terms of account structure, consolidation is a must. And for app installs, Facebook recommend to have 9 campaigns in total. And then each campaign is limited to 5 ad set of the same optimization type. In terms of the buying options, they recommend running only auction buying. And then if you want to run reach and frequency, it's unfortunately not going to be available for in-app or app install campaigns, but you can run it for your regular campaigns if you'd like. And then I think we already reviewed the conversion events. And as I mentioned, like top 8 events will be maximum that you can select. But then the other ones, let's say if you have a few additional ones that you still want to have, you can still have, you'll just need to use those for custom conversions or reporting, but not for optimization. And another note here, which is pretty important, is that custom audiences might decrease. Obviously, they are based on the first-party data, and because we're going to have less and our pools will be smaller, so we'll obviously have smaller pools for custom audiences as well. And the last point here was that if you choose certain bid strategies like cost cap or minimum ROAS, this ad set that you selected those bid strategy for will have to run for at least 3 full days. Okay, and I also wanted to review reporting limitations as well. So we can expect delay up to 3 days for all iOS 14 devices campaigns, which means that we'll not have real-time reporting. In terms of statistical modeling, I know Nik spent a lot of time discussing this. This is very similar to Google. Facebook will use statistical modeling to account for results. And then there also will be some limitations when you select, when you basically run your reports. Some of the breakdowns will not be available, such as age, gender, region, placements. All of those will not be supported specifically for iOS 14 devices. And I think for me personally, the attribution window is the most important. So basically, Facebook is removing 28-day attribution window at all. And the default from now on will be 7 days for click attribution window. Okay, and I wanted to finish off with some recommendation from MightyHive side on what you can do to prepare. So the first thing we would recommend, because your ability to map ROAS will be reduced, you can use KPIs, like a proxy KPIs, in addition to your regular KPIs. So for example, if you always use the CPA, you can start using CPC, CTRs, or CPMs, and this is in addition to evaluate your performance. Another thing that you can do is you can expand your custom audience. So I think Nik also touched on that. So for example, if you had used your custom audiences in the fall, they might be way larger than what you will see right now. So you might want to just add additional audiences, or you can also, if you use lookalikes, you can just increase the percentile for that audience as well to kind of make sure that you will have enough people in the audience to target. Another thing that we recommend is using marketing mix modeling, and you can use it, as a go-to strategy when determining the value. And obviously, with this will require way more resources, but this is something that you can think about and definitely will be handy this year. And the last thing I wanted to mention was if the measurement is a must and you don't want to use those proxy KPIs like CTR and CPCs are not that important to you, what you can start doing is you can start creating campaigns that are targeting only Android devices. So on Facebook, actually, there is a feature that you can use that's just an audience that you can select that targets Android devices. And if you like, you can even have 2 separate campaigns, one targeting Android devices and one targeting iOS devices. Great, so I'll pass it over back to Arden to sum up what we have discussed today.
Thank you, Nik and Iryna. That was really informative. So let's go to the next slide. So just to recap here for everyone, what we want you to take away from this webinar is that iOS 14.5 is rolling out next week, and that will include ATT. In-app campaigns will be hardest hit. So if you are advertising in-app, that's where you're going to see the biggest impact. When we think about what will motivate consumers to share their data and opt in, it's whether they trust the brand and understand the benefits of sharing their data. So, if you're able to communicate that you can give them a free app experience if they share their data, then that may land with them. Next, familiarize yourself with Google conversion modeling as well as Facebook's equivalent, and start making the necessary changes to your Facebook campaign now. So Iryna gave you some really practical tips that you can go and do now if you haven't done so already. The next point here is really start testing. Start doing split tests, start using proxies, just start testing and start thinking about what you're doing and how you want to start measuring moving forward. And then lastly, continue to future-proof your business. First-party data is going to continue to reign supreme. So that's a really important thing to focus on as we move into the future. We want to make sure that we have privacy-safe ways of being able to use data and to advertise. Okay, so that concludes the presentation portion of the webinar. Now we're going to move on to the Q&A period. And I'm going to introduce you to Melissa Memon. She is a project lead on our core business, and she's going to be moderating the questions. So over to you, Mel. And she's also the proud owner of Homer, who tied in the poll. So I'm sure she's very, very thrilled with the results.
Thank you for the intro. Thank you everyone who voted. Hi everyone. So I just wanted to give a quick shout out to all the participants who asked questions during this masterclass webinar. It's awesome to see the engagement. This is our first one, so I'm glad to see all this engagement during the session. We are going to go through as many questions as we can, but don't worry if we don't get through your question live. The team will follow up with an email directly to you. So just to kick it off really quick, I was able to sort through the questions while Arden, Nik, and Iryna were talking. This is a great first question because we just went through a lot of information. All right, so question 1, if there is one thing that I need to take away from this webinar, what should it be? Arden, did you want to jump in for that one?
Yeah, I'll take this one. Thanks, Mel. So as I've been reiterating a few times during the webinar, really we want everyone to be aware that iOS 14.5, the update is coming next week for a wide rollout, and that ATT will be part of that rollout. So this means start preparing today if you haven't done so already. Take those steps that Iryna and Nik mentioned, get organized. We'll follow up as well with a list of resources that you can refer back to when we send out the slides and the recording of the webinar. So you can look at, you can start reading up about conversion modeling, and we'll send links to where you can find more information to actually implement these changes. Continue to invest in future-proofing your business, right? It's really important that you look to have privacy-safe strategies moving forward, because we don't know what the changes that Apple is planning in the future. So that means investing your first-party data, start experimenting with split tests and proxies, and consider media mix modeling. We know a lot of sometimes people can get focused on really bottom of the funnel metrics, but I think this is going to be a change that will encourage people to start looking at things from a bigger picture and take a step back and really find out, what are my investments doing for me and how is that impacting my business as a whole.
Cool, thanks, Arden. All right, so while you're talking, I have another question lined up. I'm going to get Iryna to speak about this one. Do you think we will see an increase in CPAs this year because of these changes?
That's a very good question. And I think a lot of our clients are wondering if this will be the case. And I think that there are lots of factors that obviously influence the CPAs. And I think Facebook and Google are doing a lot to prevent this from happening. So we covered a lot of things, like even the modeled conversions is the way to kind of help us to optimize and make sure that those CPAs is going to stay low. But I honestly think that this probably will happen. And all you can do is prepare. All you can do is go in the platform, start testing, use some of the strategy that we recommended, explore your first-party audiences, maybe start conversation with some premium websites or apps, maybe test, we mentioned the contextual targeting. There's a lot of things you can do to prepare, and I feel like if you will prepare and take all of those steps, the impact will be minimum.
Great, thanks, Iryna. Hopefully, anonymous attendee, we answered your question. All right, next audience question. This is a juicy one. Google specific. Nik, how accurate are Google's modeled conversions?
Yeah, I can take this, I guess, since I walked through a little bit before. Well, first off, you don't really have to trust Google. You don't need to leverage model conversions if you don't want to, right? No one's forcing you to include model conversions into your data. You can opt out there. So the good news is no one's forcing you to do this. This is a change that I would definitely suggest to do, but totally fair if you have some concerns or skepticism there. I tend to see it as Google has a pretty good track record of building some pretty great algorithms and improving on them, right? Whether it's through Google search or their bid strategies and a few of their different Google owned products, like we've seen how they work around improving those algorithms and how strong they get. So I wouldn't really see it to be any differently from improving the model conversions and how they're built. And same with other algorithms in the past, we won't really have that, complete view in terms of how they're built. Like that won't really be something we'll ever get, I don't think. But we are starting to see Google kind of release, like they have mentioned a couple of the machine learning techniques that they're using to validate the data and how accurate it is. So there is some kind of insight in terms of how they're measuring and modeling the conversions. So we have that to look at as well. And they've also mentioned that their goal is really not to kind of over attribute conversions, right? Their goal is just to only include high conviction conversions, so that they're not kind of just saying, hey, we have the lowest CPA, but their goal is to be a little bit more conservative so that we can remain as accurate as possible and not over attribute, which I guess is the main concern, right? That people would fairly have, is that they don't want to over attribute conversions. They want to make sure it's accurate. And at least we can rely there on Google saying, hey, their goal is to measure high conviction conversions, not to over attribute. So we have that as well. But again, you totally have the right to not opt in if you want to wait a few months, a few years to see how they improve this. And then when you're comfortable, you can opt in that way.
Cool.
And sorry, I wanted to add to that because I said that there was like a question related to a Safe 360. Basically, I think model conversions were available for a Safe 360 about 2 years ago. So it's not anything. It's not something that they just implemented now. It's something that they have been working for a while. So I think like if you choose to include or not to include model conversions, I would definitely include them because they will help you optimize your campaigns.
Awesome. Thanks, Iryna and Nik. All right, next one here. What type of marketers are going to be impacted by this change, most impacted by this change? Iryna?
Yeah, I can take this one. Basically, and I mentioned this in my slides, so anyone who will be running mobile app install campaigns will be impacted. And then anyone who's basically targeting any mobile devices and using website conversions to track those like ads on mobile devices basically will be impacted. And I think for me, the most important thing is that it's going to be basically 50% of your market. So we had that like a slide with a chart where you can see that 50% of the market of all mobile devices is basically iOS. So you can think that like 50% of the market will be impacted. And then from there, we don't really know how many people will say yes to tracking. There are lots of different stats. We've seen like anywhere from like 50, 60% to like 40, 30%. No one knows at this point, but we know that there will be an impact. So that's why we wanted to run this webinar basically and help you to prepare to the changes.
Cool. Thanks. Thanks so much, Iryna. All right. I'm so sorry, Nik. I'm going to pass this really loaded question up to you.
Go for it. Go for it. I'm ready.
Where do you see privacy going?
Yeah, okay, that's a bit loaded. Not just loaded, I guess, but you probably get a different answer from every any panelist here, or even lots of people on this call too will have their opinion. I think from the consumer side, rather than like looking at from Google's perspective, but from the consumer side, I would be happy about the trend that we're seeing, right? There's been a lot more awareness from our side, from the consumer side, in terms of how our data is being used, what's being tracked, which is good, right? We're being aware of what's going on. And we're seeing Google come out and Facebook come out and be much more transparent, I think, in the past in terms of what they're doing with that data. So I think that's a good first step that consumers we can be glad about that we're seeing, because now we're starting to see restrictions come in place, and then we're starting to see, okay, maybe a little bit of pushback from big tech companies, but at least we're seeing a little bit more transparency in terms of why they're collecting data and maybe some data that shouldn't actually be collected. So I think from that side, I'm happy to see that, but at the same time, I would think about it that I don't know if I can see a future where all of our website activity is completely anonymous, right? The Googles and Facebooks are quite dependent on that data, and there's a reason why a lot of these platforms are free, right? Part of the trade-off is offering up that data. So I don't know if I would kind of see this as being completely anonymous ever, and that's totally my opinion. I think we still need to realize how this data is being used and how critical it is for some of these companies. So I would just temper that a little bit, but I think we are moving in the right direction as far as having that transparency of how data is used. And we're just kind of seeing right now what that fine line is of what can or what should or should not be tracked, really.
Great. Thank you for sharing your opinion. I'm sorry today.
No, all good.
Okay, so it's 4:50. I think we only have time for one more. Okay, so what are some of the benefits of this privacy change?
Okay, Mel, I can jump in and take this one. I think it's building on what Nick just said, is really consumers are benefiting the most from this, right? Consumers are getting more control over their data, how their data is being used, who they want to share their data with. And Apple has really been listening to that, and they continue to be the trailblazers at the front of this, the forefront of this privacy movement, and they really champion that. So that's really positive for Apple, and I think it's really positive for consumers. I think it also opens the opportunity up to partner more with publishers, like Iryna touched on. You know, now you can look at like, who are the key publishers and vendors that I want to partner with that have a lot of first party data that we want to tap into. I think we're going to see more people reverting back to things like contextual targeting. You know, what's the type of content that I want to be aligned with? So I think that's an opportunity for publishers. I think it could lead to less reliance on Facebook if we don't see, like, the measurement's not going to be as precise. Like, we'll find out if people are going to continue to spend as freely in Facebook if they don't see the same measurement and reporting that they're used to. And then something that we've touched on a few times in this webinar, I think, you know, we're going to see an uptick in media mix modeling. I think people are going to start looking at things from a bigger picture, as we can't measure as granular as we were used to before, just to really understand what the impact of your advertising dollars are in various channels.
Yeah, just to add to that, in terms of consumers, I think everyone knows that this is a very hot topic. And if you go like on LinkedIn, you will see like tons of people posting about it, how they are happy that they now have control, that they have that option to select, that they don't want anyone to track their activity. So I think this is very important for consumers. I totally agree with Arden on this.
Okay, well, thank you, Iryna. So that's it for the questions for today. We'll move on to the last slide. I just wanted to thank everyone for coming. We had a really, really good turnout. This was our first masterclass webinar, and we really appreciate you coming and taking the time to listen to this topic today. If you still have a question that wasn't answered, or you've just thought of something at any time, please feel free to email me at arden@mightyhive.com. Or alternatively, you can reach out to your account manager. They can give you, sign you up for a copy of our accounts newsletter, which we send out on a monthly basis. And we include updates that are happening in the industry, as well as specific changes to iOS 14. And we have a list of resources ongoing in our newsletter, so it's really helpful. And then lastly, we do want to hear from you about feedback on this webinar, as well as if you have any future episode ideas, we can take that to inform the next topic. So stay tuned for more details about the next session. We're really thankful for the support and appreciate you taking the time to attend today. So thank you, everyone. Thank you to our panelists as well, and for those who participated in our polls and our Q&A session. We really appreciate it. And have a
Sorry, and I know that there's a couple questions that we didn't answer because we had quite a lot. So we will follow up with you if your question wasn't answered. So don't worry. We see you.
And
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, we will be sharing the slides and a recording and the list of iOS 14 resources that you can reference for future.
Well, thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay.
Have a great day.
Bye.